late for it here. Yeah. Cynthia's Cafe. Sorry, could we? Um, so, okay, so it's Sepulveda. It's just, um, so it's on Sepulveda. So it's just follow the direction. So keep, so go back to Sepulveda, and then you'll go left. Yeah. Yep. You're welcome. So walking through Westwood in the aftermath of the big UCLA riots and police finally cracking down, and let's see what the aftermath is like. G'day, mate. How are things in jolly old England? I am about a mile or so from UCLA right now. So it's 7 o'clock in the morning here in Los Angeles, and I like to start my day perusing the elite publications. So I read New Yorker article on the campus protests. So the New Yorker article is obviously left-wing publication, and it pointed out that part of what's fueling the campus anti-Israel, pro-Palestine protests is a generation gap, in a sense that the institutions are hypocritical. So as a trad, as someone on the right, I recognize that most of our institutions are dominated by the liberal left. But for people on the left, they recognize that our institutions are dominated by the non-left. So there's probably a sweet spot where both points of view can be reconciled, and that is our institutions tend to be dominated by the center left, by the liberal left, not the left, and certainly not the classically liberal, but by the center left, the liberal left. And there is no parallel for the United States relationship with Israel. It is weird. The United States sends something like $4 billion a year to a prosperous country like Israel, which is perfectly capable of standing on its own 2 feet. And I think it's weird that we sent over $100 billion worth of aid to Ukraine. But this New Yorker article said that these campus protests are fueled by a distrust of institutions which they feel are hypocritical. And all institutions are going to be hypocritical because all institutions will rely on standards. Right? You can't run an institution without standards, without rules, without policies and procedures. And enforcement of all rules is always going to contain a considerable human and arbitrary element. Right? It's not possible to have laws and rules and policies and procedures that are just carried out in some completely disinterested, unbiased way. So whenever you have an institution, you have rules, policies, procedures that will always be enforced somewhat arbitrarily. And the anarchic youthful spirit is going to rebel against that. You can't have an institution without having some standards, policies, procedures. Whenever you have standards, policies, procedures, and rules, they're always going to be enforced in a somewhat arbitrary way. You'll always be hypocritical because you'll always be standing up for standards, policies, procedures, rules, laws you don't fully live up to and that are not perfectly enforced and are never perfectly consistent, because the situation is often changing every day. And so we have laws that are meant for one institution, say meant to govern one people, that are not so well suited for governing different people, right? Different ethnic groups all right, they're going to have different social norms. They're going to have different attitudes towards law enforcement. They're going to want differing levels of law enforcement. So, generally speaking, white, Asian, and prosperous Latino communities want stricter law enforcement than we currently have, and parts of the Latino community, large parts of the African American community, want less strict law enforcement and punishment than we currently have. Right? So, generally speaking, whites, Asians, and prosperous Latinos want more punishment for crime than we currently have. But large swaths of the African American community, and probably some parts of the Hasidic community, right? Some parts of Hasidic Judaism are not real big on punishment, not really big on law enforcement, which was something of a shock to me because they are tending to be right wing, but strongly identifying in groups that like it when our groups enforce the law against them or punish them. So, for a strongly identifying Jew, right, he may rebel at the idea of non-Jewish police and non-Jewish law enforcement, putting in prison Jews. Or if you're strongly identifying African American, you'll probably rebel at the idea of non-African American police, law enforcement, district attorneys, judges, and a criminal justice system putting in prison members of your in-group. So, yeah, it's funny. I'm on the right, and I think it's amusing. These kids are rebelling against America's institutions, when, from my perspective, America's institutions are run by the liberal left. But these kids who are doing the anti-Israel protests on college campuses, then they don't identify with the liberal left. I would assume they identify more with the left. And I have some sympathy for these protesters, right? Because I don't believe America should be subsidizing Israel. I don't believe in subsidies in general, right? I recognize that the way the American political system works is that pressure groups are incentivized to organize, to fundraise, and to advocate and lobby for their interests, which distorts the system. Now, if we had a unitary system like England or France, right, we would be much less vulnerable to pressure groups, to lobbies. But because we got a spread out federal system, right, the unitary system means top down. Federal system means there are many different layers of authority. There's the federal government, state government, cities, communities, all have varying degrees of authority. While England is run from the top down overwhelmingly because the English system was developed to be able to fight a war with France. And the French political system was developed to be able to fight a war with England or with Germany. And if you're constantly fighting wars, right, if you're constantly battling for your own survival, the unitary, somewhat authoritarian system is going to work better. Right, let's have a look at the chat. Liberalism has been an acid on our civilization, says the chat. Interesting how Jews always look out for their best interests, but then Jews claim that it is immoral for whites to care about their self-interest. Well, there are Jews on the left and Jews on the right. So Jews on the right have pretty similar opinions to non-Jews on the right in America. So it's not like Jews have this more intense, disproportionate hatred of white identity politics than other groups, right? You really think Jews more than blacks or Asians or parts of the Latino community, right, have an allergy to white identity politics. So in our federal system, right, lobbies like AARP, the American Association for Retired Persons, right? Incredibly effective at getting things done, right? So we have arranged a social welfare system that is particularly generous to people both in retirement and people saving towards retirement. Right? We have a vastly distorted social welfare system that disproportionately, and I would say unfairly, benefits people saving for retirement and in retirement as opposed to younger people. And why is that? Because older people are much more effective at forming intense pressure lobby groups. So, why does the United States subsidize Israel? Because the pro Israel lobby is particularly effective, right? They spend their money effectively, they know how to exert pressure, they know how to get things done. So, let's say you wanted to develop a piece of property, or you wanted to expand a building, right? So, I'm thinking about the Museum of Tolerance on Pico Boulevard. Right? They wanted to expand their building so that they could host bar mitzvahs and other events. But they didn't do it without consulting their neighbors. And so they received tremendous pushback from their neighbors. On the other hand, when LeBron James moves into a neighborhood and recognizes that that's going to cause some disruption for his neighbors, like, the first thing he does is have baked goods, cookies and muffins delivered to all the neighbors. So if you want to do something and get along with your neighbors, you get to know them, you give them like a phone number and email address to send you with their concerns, right? And then you're going to be much less likely to have neighbors allying against you and working against you, right? If you show an open spirit of cooperation. And how does this apply to the Israel lobby? The Israel lobby is very effective, right? They find out who you're close to, if you're an important person, if you're a politician, and they will get a point person for you, right? Someone who you're naturally aligned with, naturally feel comfortable with, ideally that you have a strong pre-existing relationship, and this point person will exercise personal pressure on you to vote in a pro-Israel direction. Right? There are effective ways of doing things, and there are ineffective ways of doing things. And the pro-Israel lobby and the AARP lobby, right, probably the two of the most effective lobbies, right? They do things the effective way. And so it's worth learning from effective ways that people get things done. The Democratic Party in 2020, they very effectively rearranged rules on voting that probably worked in their own best interests. And they got subsidies for Democratic leaning urban strongholds. Right? They got massive subsidies to make vote counting in those areas much more efficient. Right? They simply played the game. They won the 2020 election within the rules of the game by modifying the rules of the game more effectively than did the Republicans. Now, Republicans on average are older than Democrats, so voting by mail is naturally more aligned with what is naturally in Republicans' interests, right? Republicans are more likely than Democrats to have jobs, to have families, to have children, to have communal and religious responsibilities. And so it's very much a Republican interest to have vote by mail. And now, for the first time in American history, well, at least in the last 100 years that we know of, I believe, eligible voters who don't vote are more likely to vote Republican than they are Democrat. So the Democrats long thought to have, lower intensity voters, but now lowest intensity voting bloc is majority Republican, and so everything the Republicans can do, essentially, to make voting easier for these low intensity voters will work in their favor, including vote by mail. But Republicans didn't play the game in a very particularly smart way in 2020. And they may have gotten a bit smarter since then. But times have changed, right? When low intensity voters are more likely to vote Democrat, then it's in Republicans' best interest to make voting as difficult and challenging as possible, so that only the most incentivized people show up to vote. That's playing the game in a smart way. The motion picture industry, Hollywood, has been particularly effective at lobbying and applying pressure, so they get vast subsidies and long outstanding copyrights for their work. So I used to date this free market economist, and her job was working for an organization that procured subsidies for TV and movie filming. And the job went completely against the principles. That was the job she had. So, yeah, ideally, we all work in jobs that are just aligned with our principles. But it usually doesn't work out that way. And I see nothing hypocritical in a meaningful sense where you're a functionary procuring subsidies, even though you're a free market economist who doesn't believe in subsidies. That's the job she could get. And effective people like deal with reality and make the most of the situation that they're in. So there were signs that the pro-Palestine crowd is becoming much more effective. So they managed to persuade their supporters, don't talk to the press. You don't want your supporters, in general, speaking to the press if there's a high likelihood they're going to make fools of themselves. So the pro-Palestine protesters had effective discipline that only the articulate media trained people on their side, generally speaking, spoke to the press, which sucks for me when I'm trying to interview people at a pro-Palestine protest. But it's good for the cause. And I'm just realizing something obvious that you probably already saw or knew. I just completely missed. Right? Why did the pro-Palestine protesters live in tents and create encampments? Now, they did similar things, did they not, to protest South Africa, right? They erected shanty towns. But with regard to the pro-Palestine protests, these shanty towns, these encampments, these tents, didn't have particular meaning. And it was such an obvious meaning that I missed. But most people in Gaza are living in camps. They're living in tents. Right? 95% of housing has been damaged or destroyed in Gaza. And so you effectively have a situation where approximately 3 million people in Gaza are living in tents right now. And so, such an obvious point that I missed it. I recognize the symbolism and the power of living in tents and building encampments. Now, if you do it in a way that breaks the law and interferes with the rights of other people, you're going to lose sympathy. You're not going to gain sympathy. So this is where the pro-Palestine crowd made a major mistake by harassing students and only allowing them to pass if they were anti-Israel, anti-Zionist. All right. Even people who are disinterested, who didn't have a dog in the fight, are going to be turned off by that. Also, another major mistake that pro-Palestine protesters made, we also see the same with most left-wing protests, is that they desecrate and decimate and damage public property. They leave it filthy. They fill it with graffiti and trash. Right? You don't see that, generally speaking, with right-wing rallies. Right? The Tea Party, the Republicans, when they get together and rally, they don't leave behind vast amounts of trash. So the Japanese, when they go to the World Cup, right, they pick up their own trash. These pro-Palestine protests would have been much more effective if they'd been out there picking up their own trash. But instead, they just created a mess. And people don't like it when you leave a massive mess behind. So partisans, they don't think so much about the consequences of what they're doing. Right? They just think about what feels good. But if you want to be effective, right, you want to be reaching those people in the middle who aren't already decided in their point of view. And when you disrupt normal campus life, right, most people go to college for pragmatic reasons, to advance their life prospects, to get married, to get an education so that they can get a better job, make more money. Right? The overwhelming majority of college students did not appreciate these protests because it made their concerns more difficult to achieve. So if you act and speak in a way that makes life for those around you more difficult, you're going to lose support. And the more you had Black Lives Matter rallies 2020, the more support we saw for Donald Trump. And then with these pro-Palestine rallies, if anything, I think it will predispose Americans who don't have a strong feeling one way or another to, in all likelihood, side against Palestine. Because let's face it, most people care only about themselves and their loved ones and their group and their nation. Right? Americans care primarily about Americans. So I have considerable sympathy for much of the pro-Palestine protests, and that I don't think America should be subsidizing Israel. And the death of 35,000 Gazans is horrifying, even if there is a strong case to be made that Israel's doing most everything it can to hold down civilian casualties while they're tackling Hamas. The trash and degradation left behind by these pro-Palestine protests and the disruption they're causing, people just want to go about their lives and get an education, and it's going to turn off most people. So UCLA, unlike Berkeley, does not have a history of student activism. And so many students have gotten a nasty surprise that the stated values of the institution they're attending, like Cornell, don't align with reality. And this is true throughout life. Right? You can take a sports score as face value, and you can take a stock market report at face value, but everything else aside from those objective numbers cannot be taken at face value. And so when universities say how supportive they are of student activism and how proud they are that 1968, 69 Students for Democratic Society protested the Vietnam War, right? You would be naive if you think that this stated value is the real value. Right? People say all sorts of things about themselves that are not true, are not predominantly true, but don't outweigh every other value. It's like the sophisticated person recognizes that values operate in a constellation. Okay? So freedom is a good value, but so is order and predictability and stability. And empathy and compassion are good values, but you also have to do tough, difficult things at times. So sometimes there are more important values than empathy. Sometimes there are more important values than freedom. Joe Biden, his initial early reactions to the October 7 Hamas attacks said that Hamas had beheaded 40 babies. It reminds me of all the stories that we heard about German atrocities with regard to Belgium in the early part of World War One, stories that turned out to be substantially fabricated. Also, we heard stories about the horrors of Iraq's invasion of Kuwait, turned out to be substantially fabricated. And many of the horrible things that the Iraqis supposedly did when they conquered Kuwait in 1990 didn't happen. And now there are more and more journalists questioning the New York Times account of massive amounts of rape. So I have no idea how much rape occurred on October 7. I'm not taking a position one way or another. But if it turns out that the amount of rape that occurred on October 7th was exaggerated. It turns out that the number of babies who were beheaded by Hamas on October 7th was exaggerated. That's going to work against the stated cause. But people, activists pushing a cause, they routinely lie, they routinely exaggerate, because they get carried away by their feelings. They get carried away by what feels good rather than what does good. But the overstatement, wherever and however it occurs, to quote E.B. White in his book, The Elements of Style, overstatement, wherever and however it occurs, has the power to destroy for the reader, for the listener, right, the object of your fascination, the object of your intention. And there's no faster way of turning people off from your cause than exaggeration and overstatement. And yet, activists do it all the time. Like you see it on the side of Black Lives Matter, see it on the side of pro-Israel, anti-Israel. Right? Activists just routinely lie and use overstatement. So I also checked out an article this morning by George Packer in The Atlantic, and he described the authoritarian spirit, right? And he warned about the dangers of the authoritarian spirit and how it had overtaken an organization that he cared a great deal about, PEN, which is International Institution of Writers. And apparently, a PEN literary festival was cancelled because of a dispute over Gaza. And the pro-Palestine, anti-Israel forces just wanted to wreak havoc on other writers who weren't sufficiently pro-Palestine. They just wanted to make people's lives miserable. They didn't toe the political line. And so some people may naively have the idea that writers are more pro-freedom and pro-bravery and pro-individuality and saying what you believe to be true and it's unpopular, but writers are just as susceptible to peer pressure. And the authoritarian spirit is just a universal part of the human condition because it's frequently adaptive, right? There are plenty of situations that work better in an authoritarian manner. For example, at businesses, classrooms tend to operate much more effectively when they're run hierarchically rather than democratically. All right, let's have a look at the chat. Give a hoot, don't pollute. So, do you have any experience with antidepressants, specifically Lexapro? Yes, I have experience with antidepressants. They're not terribly effective. So, on the other hand, an antidepressant changed my life. So I was bedridden for 6 years between age 22, 21, 22, and 27. And none of the doctors I went to could figure out what was wrong. So, in retrospect, I realized some of them were giving me a hint about what was wrong because they may have expressed some concerns about my vegetarian diet. And my vegetarian diet was the ultimate cause of my health problems because once I started taking beef organ capsules 3 years ago, all my health problems disappeared. But anyway, I was bedridden in my 20s, had to drop out of this institution, UCLA, because of my chronic fatigue syndrome. And I tried Wellbutrin, I tried various antidepressants. They didn't do anything. But then there was this, I don't know if it's properly called an antidepressant, but it's an MAO inhibitor, Nardil, Nardil. And once I got on that, I was able to resume 2/3 of a normal life. So if I'd been on Nardil from early on in my collapse into chronic fatigue syndrome, I would not have had to drop out of UCLA. I would have been able to have a normal life because your 20s is when your life normally gets started. So in some situations for some people, some medications can be absolutely life transforming. And Nadil changed my life. I went from bedridden, right, where effectively I'd only get like on average an hour a day of a normal life, to I got like I don't know, 12 hours of a normal life. I got 2/3 of a normal life. I got mostly a normal life as long as I did not exercise too much, right? So after getting on Nadil from age 27 until age 55, as long as I kept my exercise, it's no more than an average of about 2 miles walking a day, I was okay. But if I considerably exceeded that amount of exercise, then I'd get a relapse. My body just couldn't handle much exercise. And all this went away once I started taking B4 capsules. Uh, as I understand it, vitamin B12 is hard to assimilate. You can't just take tablets or shots. Uh, so my working theory is that the way vitamin B12 is situated in these B4 capsules, right, my body's able to assimilate it. And so I had any of the symptoms of vitamin B12 deficiency. I think a vegetarian diet is just a disaster. It's bad for you socially, it's bad for you mentally, it's bad for you emotionally, it's bad for your health. Then there may be individual exceptions, right? Diet is often individual. The type of diet that works for one person doesn't work for another. So I've never tried Lexapro, but there is an area where psychiatry has consistent success, and that's dealing with ADHD. And so if your depression and your anxiety is the result of untreated ADHD, then getting treated for ADHD is about 95% likely to be very quickly effective and will turn around your depression. Like if your depression is related to your low functioning due to your ADHD, if your depression and anxiety is related to the emotional turmoil and then the poor choices you make because of your ADHD, and getting treated for ADHD will have profound effects on your depression level and anxiety level. So ADHD is the most studied part of psychiatry, and it's the most successful part of psychiatry. Psychiatric medication is like 5 times more effective than antidepressant medication. So SSRIs, right, they help some people, but overall they just have about a placebo effect. So there is adaptive depression, right, when you're failing at life, all right, then you will normally naturally be sad, and that's not a medical condition, right? It's if you're succeeding at life, right? You just got a promotion, you're making more money, you got a beautiful wife, you're an esteemed member of your community, you're living out your values, you're you're in the middle of a religious community that you love, and on the face of it, your life is working really well, and then you get depressed, all right? That's maladaptive depression. So, talking to the chat, is your depression maladaptive or adaptive? Right? Is your depression a normal, natural, healthy response to a life that isn't working? Because a lot of men in particular react to a life that isn't working by making their life smaller and smaller, by essentially going into a cave and, depending on their politics, they're hoping for an ultimate redemptive apocalypse. My father specialized in apocalyptics, so I want to do more research on this theory of mine. But I noticed it from a stream last Sunday where there was an Anglo-Australian making some painfully honest commentary about the only thing he cared about in life was waiting for some massive civil war between white people. I thought that's just so sad, right? There's just so much more in life to care about. And that's the problem when you get sucked into, particularly alluring type of politics, so it can just absolutely take over your life and blind you from everything else that matters. So the old joke goes, normal people don't talk about racial and religious differences. And then members of the alt-right, right, once people, quote unquote, get red pilled on this, that's all they can talk about. And that's usually quite maladaptive because it makes other people uncomfortable. And when you make other people uncomfortable, you're hurting them, you're harming them, you're disturbing their equilibrium. They're going to distance themselves from you. I just saw a terrific video, and it's near the top of my blog. Why people don't understand you. I don't know about you, but I've gone through my life feeling like people just don't understand me. And she had terrific explanations. So one explanation is that you're an obvious hypocrite, right? So an extreme, painful, uncomfortable degree of hypocrisy. So you may wear religious insignia, but frequently act in a way completely incompatible with your religion's ideals. If you have leaky feelings, so you stand for one thing and you pretend to be for one thing, but your anxiety and your feelings keep leaking out and contradicting what you supposedly stand for, right, that's going to make people uncomfortable. All right, the more congruent you are, the more comfortable people will be around you. So if you're congruent and if you're open, if you're nice, if you learn people's names, you have a desire to be helpful, you're going to get along with people and make friends. Now, I've often had all of those qualities, but accompanied it with the unfortunate quality of saying inappropriate things, all right, mocking individuals and institutions that people around me found sacred, mocking ideas, beliefs, practices that people around me found sacred. And so even though I was nice and open and helpful, right, my inappropriate comments would just sabotage my social standing. And I would go into sort of exile. I would become a Palestinian of the soul. I remember going into therapy many years ago saying, I don't think anyone at my synagogue cares about me. And the therapist says, well, do you care about anyone there? Excellent challenge. So you care about other people, you try to be helpful, you learn their name, and you're congruent, right? You're going to tend to have good relations with others. So what are the other reasons people don't understand us? Right? When we're incongruent, we're painfully, obviously hypocritical, when we're ill at ease with ourselves, so when we're struggling with stuff, like when we're dealing with anxiety, depression, people naturally distance themselves. So I remember when I was dealing with chronic fatigue syndrome in my 20s, my peers would distance themselves because it was just too distressing to see someone who looked healthy and who had been high achieving just absolutely fall apart. So the natural human inclination is to distance yourselves from people who are going through psychological and dramatic health problems. So yeah, reading George Packer's article in The Atlantic this morning about the authoritarian spirit, which he says is overtaking pen. The reason we have the authoritarian spirit is that sometimes that's adaptive, right? Most of life doesn't run along democratic lines, it runs on hierarchical lines. And all political discussions and policies and laws and procedures and governance have a substantial element of authoritarianism, right? Tax laws are ultimately backed up by the power of the IRS to confiscate money from you, confiscate property, and to throw you in prison, right? Violating tax laws is what got Al Capone stopped and arrested and convicted. So there's no politics that does not have a substantial authoritarian element. Right? If you are upset and aghast at Israel's war in Gaza, you are simultaneously trying to limit Israel's response to being attacked, trying to limit Israel's ability to defend itself. And Israel does not like receiving missiles and bombs and attacks from Hamas. And after putting up with Hamas missiles landing on their territory for a long time, right? Oh, it's still closed off up there. That's interesting. Israel's fighting back. Right? What kind of nation or country would put up with having missiles flying into their territory? So the area where the encampment was is still closed off, and there's security there. But probably the pro-Palestine crowd is threatening to come back. So do you think that these pro-Palestine students, average students academically or below average, right? I suspect that a large part of this protest and these type of protests, which routinely occur before exams, the result of affirmative action beneficiaries not wanting to be held accountable to normal academic standards. I remember in my teens and 20s, I had a vast overestimation of my own abilities. Then you encounter every institution with its standards that will always be somewhat arbitrarily enforced. And so I think it's natural for young people to revolt against the apparent hypocrisy of institutions, whether they're controlled by the left or the right, or the center right, and the center left. I think that's just part of the nature of a youth versus power dynamic. I remember in my 20s having this vast overestimation of my own abilities. When you encounter institutions, they're not as amenable to your self-estimation as you would like. So yeah, much of UCLA is still blocked off after the pro-Palestine encampment. I remember the shock of your first job. I like the metaphor that being employed is like being a slave. I don't say that with rage and resentment, but you are there to be the instrument of your employer. And for people who suffer from an inaccurate sense of self, have an exaggerated self-importance, this is going to be really hard to deal with. And so that first job can be shocking. So I took my first job at age 11, but till I think age 16 or 17, I got fired from every job I had. I did bring my mask. So I often wear a mask riding public transport. I find it kind of comforting. And I think if you're in a confined space, a lot of other people, particularly during influenza season, that it's still blocked off, that wearing a mask in a confined space like a subway or a bus just makes sense. But it's not influenza season, so it might be stupid. But I often wear one anyway. And virtue signaling is virtuous. Now, interesting that both the campus protesters and the alt-right dissidents both wanted to stay anonymous. And that is often a useful strategy as long as you are clear that you are reducing your effectiveness. On the other hand, many people want to make a dramatic effect on the world and to stand up for what they believe is right and put their real name out there, but then they are unable to stand up to the consequences. So staying anonymous, if you're going to be doing something that's risky for your life, prospects, and for your career, probably a wise way to go. So I don't deride, castigate, look down upon political protesters who choose anonymity. Also, there are many spiritual virtues of anonymity, right? Not making it all about you is a good thing, because usually 95% of what we do is all about us. I tell my sponsees, if you can operate at, say, a 90% level of selfishness instead of the normal 95%, you're ahead of the game. That's a good thing. So I see this with live streamers and pundits and podcasters, that they hit what they think is a vein of gold in content. So it may be that very typical line of thought is that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy, and then they just mine this perspective over and over again. Or, as is true with Walker Cohn and Fox News, there's another attitude that the elite are much more of a threat to democracy than Donald Trump, because people find a niche, right? They find a shaft of gold. So I used to live in Auburn, which is gold country. It's about 45 minutes drive north of Sacramento. In 1849, gold was found in this area. And so thousands of people descended on it to mine for gold. And if you dug a shaft and you started getting nuggets of gold, you would keep working on this shaft, right, until it had run dry. And you see the same dynamic with live streamers and podcasters, right? When they hit a shaft of insight or content on the world, right? And this is where all the UCLA protests took place, right? It's the number one story this week in the nation. The violent UCLA counter protests on Tuesday night, which was the end of Passover, and then UCLA's decision to clear the pro-Palestine encampment on Wednesday. So Wednesday, Thursday, number one story in the nation right here at UCLA, which does not have a history of loud campus activism, right? Nothing like UC Berkeley. So I used to go to UCLA. I took a class in European economic history in this building right here. Go to Powell Library over there. This is the quad. This is the center of UCLA. And so the pro-Palestine people took over the center of UCLA and restricted entry to the library into normal pathways for students unless they effectively pledged loyalty to the anti-Israel pro-Palestine cause. So this would make disinterested observers unsympathetic to the pro-Palestine point of view. So universities are dominated by the liberal left, but they also have to operate within reality, right? They also need funding, and professors have to raise funding, and some of it is from official government sources, but a lot of it's from private industry. Right? You get more brownie points for impact scholarship, right, which may be ephemeral and meretricious and false. Right? So there are perverse incentives that operate within academia, but academia is still part of the real world. Right? It's a dominant talking point on right-wing talk radio that university is like living in a kindergarten. It's not the real world. It's still the real world. Right? You have to pay your fees. Universities have to pay their professors and their staff. They have to operate a vast institution with thousands of employees. They have to navigate government funding, private funding, student funding. This is still the real world. And the same skills that lead to success at UCLA, other academic institutions, by and large translate into the real world. Right? You follow the rules, you'll be more successful than if you violate the rules. If you locate the centers of power and you learn the code of the people who have power, right, you'll be more successful than if you don't learn the code of the people who have power. Right? If you do your assignments, you'll be more successful in school and work than if you don't do your assignments. So here's my proof of why universities are part of the real world. Right? The success that people find at university tends to translate into the real world. Highest achievers in the academy tend to be highest achievers in the real world. And learning to get along with professors, right? Learning to accommodate the whims, preferences of your professors, even if you don't understand or share their whims, right? The same skills will translate into your real life success in the workplace. Right? Learning to subjugate your ego to the exigencies of the situation will serve you well, both in the academy and outside of the academy. So UCLA, quiet activism history, right? Much milder, about 10% of the intensity of student protests at Berkeley, 60s and 70s and the 80s. But for a brief 3 days this week, UCLA became the most talked about center of protest and counter-protest. So why was UCLA so quiet in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, and now at the center of protest today? Right? Because the student body composition of UCLA is probably different than it was in the 60s, 70s, and 80s. I heard Dennis Prager say on the Dennis and Julie show that you can no longer make any generalizations about Americans. Yeah, the more diverse we get, right, the less we have in common with each other, and the more difficult it is to form bonds, to create social cohesion, social trust, and to make useful generalizations about America. Now, the founding people of a country will have a profound effect on its institutions, on its rhetoric, and even when their numbers diminish, such as the case with Anglos, right? Anglos still have a disproportionate influence on how America works because our judicial system and our political system is dominantly Anglo. Damn, I missed Glib Medley's commentaries that have been deleted. This is the UCLA Law School. So UCLA is among the top 10 of America's universities when you're grading on the basis of faculty research, right? So if you're grading strictly on the quality of undergraduate education, right, probably not top 10. But if you're grading on the quality of graduate schools, UCLA is definitely in the top 10. It's law school, probably in the top 20. And long somewhat been in the shadow of Berkeley, but increasingly coming out of that shadow. Very different vibe at UCLA, much calmer, more genteel vibe, or LA vibe at UCLA compared to Berkeley. At universities like Cornell and Columbia, which is so proud of their activism history, right? So you go to a job, go to a university, go to a church, and they extol all sorts of values, which may have absolutely nothing to do with their real values. And individuals' public pronouncements about this or that are not particularly likely to reflect what he really values. And so many students have gotten education in the nature of reality that university's stated value of glorifying dissent and activism doesn't necessarily correlate with their real values. And if you want to succeed in the workplace or in an academy or with a particular professor, or with just an individual or community, a synagogue, a church, right, you have to be able to distinguish between that individual and that institution's real values and their stated values, right? No necessary connection between the institution's stated values and what they really value. And when it comes to protests and activism, right, it's a lot easier to value that when it's in the past, when it's causing chaos and disruption in the present, right? People don't like that. Even lefties who are running universities don't like chaos and disruption because it hinders their ability to pursue their hero system and their prestige. And it's hard to get substantial things done when there's chaos and disruption and students' ideological and racial and ethnic identities are making it difficult to move around campus and to use basic campus facilities. This is where all the cable TV setups are these days about the aftermath of the protests. So why are the protests not one story in America? Because you get action video, you get conflict, you get fights, you get something that's compelling to watch, you get theatre, you get drama. There's a saying, "Oh, the world loves a lover." It doesn't. What the world loves is a fight. A fight is far more compelling than a loving. But what's showy and compelling is really important. Berkeley is in free fall, says Elliot Blatt. Has the elimination of the SAT changed the culture of UCLA? It's probably had some effect, but increasingly universities are returning to the SAT. So eliminating the SAT was a dramatic gesture that spread all around universities in 2020, 2021. But now the winds of change are blowing in the opposite direction, and universities are restoring these objective testing requirements. One thing I noticed in my education is how there seemed to be a different fad every year. So my education was damaged, number one, because I had undiagnosed ADHD. Number two, because direct competition was strongly discouraged in my Seventh-day Adventist upbringing and in my Seventh-day Adventist education. And I love competition. I thrive on competition. Competition brings out the best in me. Competition gets me excited. Competition leads me to work hard. And competition is a dirty word. In fact, I was separated and taking classes with my best friend during third and fourth grade at Avondale College primary school because I thought I was too competitive with my best friend Wayne. This insanity. Like men in particular love competition. Right? We're driven by testosterone, but Seventh-day Adventist Church is a highly feminine, nurturing organization, right? Dominated by women. Its membership is more than 2/3 women. A lot of attractive women in the church. It's all about a healthy, nurturing lifestyle. But men are dropping out, just like men are dropping out in mainstream religion in general in America, because men need a place just to be with other men. And the egalitarian liberal spirit, which has swept through mainstream religion, has stigmatized creating spaces for men just to be alone with men. But unless you protect and keep certain rituals just for men, as Dennis Prager noted, right, men are going to drop out. And men have overwhelmingly dropped out of Reform and Conservative and Reconstructionist Judaism. These institutions are increasingly dominated by women. The more they're dominated by women, the more men drop out. But in Orthodox Judaism, men and women pray separately and to varying degrees have separate social lives as well. It's a bit like Australia. Australia is the most sexually segregated of the first world countries, to the best of my knowledge. Right? Men overwhelmingly hang out with other men. Women overwhelmingly hang out with other women. You go to a Barbie, right? Men will congregate. Women will congregate much more than in America. Right? You see the same tendencies in America. It's just more intense segregation in Australia. There's a much stronger spirit and mateship in Australia, which you don't find in America's more individual society. There's just a ready bond between men that's incredibly strong. Coming up on 8 a.m. here at UCLA that I miss in America. And I find a good substitute for it in Orthodox Judaism. I attended an SDA church in New York between 1999 and 2000. It was a mafia-style run church, very masculine. Okay, so there are obviously going to be individual exceptions, but overwhelmingly, the ethos of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is nurturing, health-oriented, highly feminine. The dominant early figure of the Seventh-day Adventist Church was a female prophet, Ellen G. White. Right? Very few religions are founded by women. Right? Very few religions are women, the dominant figure, the dominant prophet behind them. And Ellen White, she would go into visions that would just happen to reinforce whatever it was that the church elders had decided. So the church elders would decide that the reason Jesus did not return to earth on Yom Kippur 1844 was because the believers had not been keeping the seventh-day Sabbath, meaning Friday night to Saturday night. And then Ellen White received a vision ratifying that position. So whenever the church male elders would arrive at a decision, Ellen White would then have a heavenly vision affirming that decision. So when you get a good niche, right, like having visions, right, people tend to mine it. And so right, as I was talking earlier, whether you're viewing Donald Trump as a major threat to democracy, right, that's a lucrative niche for many pundits and public intellectuals, or like Walter Kern, Tucker Carlson, right, if you're an anti-Trump pundit, that's also a lucrative niche. What's not a lucrative niche with a vast audience wanting to hear your insights is to take my position that sometimes the mainstream anti-Trump position is correct, and sometimes the anti-Trump position is correct, and it's entirely situational. Right? So Walter Kern thinks that news media coverage of Donald Trump is more damaging to America than Donald Trump's actions. And I think sometimes that's right, sometimes it's wrong. That January 6th was a horror show, and Donald Trump played a role in that. Once he refused to accept the legitimacy of the 2020 election result, right, he caused tremendous chaos. Once you believe that the elections are stolen, you remove all moral inhibitions from people. And that creates anarchy and chaos and danger, instability, and fractures of people. So I think what Trump did with regard to that was horrible. On the other hand, the mainstream media's fixation on a Russiagate, that Donald Trump was a pawn of Russia or that he had these nefarious ties to Russia, that was bogus. I think news media coverage of the chaotic response the Trump administration to COVID had significant legitimacy. On the other hand, when we don't really know what we're dealing with, a chaotic response may be the most adaptive response. When the Biden administration tried to mandate vaccines, right, that fueled anti-vax sentiment. So many activists, they push for things and they bring about the very opposite, just like the alt-right protesters at Charlottesville. Right? They went to protest at Charlottesville, and what they created was far more of an anti-right-wing backlash. Right? They would have been better off if they'd never held the Charlottesville rally. Right? Joe Biden and the pro-vaccine crowd would have been far better off if they'd never tried to mandate vaccines. So when you overstate, lie to promote your case. So I have sympathy for politicians and public health officials who have to boil down their messages so that they're understandable even for people with like an 85 IQ. But there are many public health messages early on when we got the COVID vaccine saying that once you got the vaccine, you would not transmit COVID. And that was just false. And the primary scientists behind the vaccine knew that that was false. Now, there does appear to be evidence that getting vaccinated reduces transmission of COVID, but it certainly doesn't eliminate it. And by overstating the case for the vaccine, making false claims on behalf of the vaccine, you fuel anti-vaccine sentiments. So it feels good. You believe you're on the side of the angels to make these dramatic arguments for your position. And it's easy to feel justified in lying or exaggerating your case. But frequently, the result of what feels great to you is terrible for your cause. Like Richard Spencer is very eloquent and dramatic in making his case, but he has so frequently exaggerated, overstated, and overstepped that he's created far more backlash to the things that he said he cared about than if he'd never spoken up at all. So too with Donald Trump, he lost the 2018 and 2020 elections because his bad behavior, overstatement, right, fueled more of a backlash than support. Now, Biden and the Democrats, right, they had power beginning in 2021, right? They had the House, the Senate, and the White House. They overstepped, overstated, exaggerated, right? Biden has enacted the most ambitious agenda of any president since probably FDR. And there's a segment of, well, the dominant ethos in the media and academia is that an administration that gets things done is the most effective. But often in life, you don't get things done. Right? Often in life, you're better off not doing anything. Right? People who quit drinking were inner directed. Who quit drinking as a result of inner contemplation rather than going to rehab. They're more likely to not drink. People who are inner directed are more likely to follow through with their intentions than people who are just responding to outside incentives. And so now more and more Americans looking back on the Trump years favorably. They have these warm memories of low inflation, prosperity, peace. First president not to get us into a new war overseas in many decades. And so after the inflation of the Biden years, the vaccine mandates, the rising dangers in Europe, Ukraine, the Middle East, now people look at Donald Trump as a person to restore stability. So Trump ran in 2015, 2016 as the overthrow candidate, the disruption candidate, the guy who's going to blow things up. Now he's running on the opposite message. He's the guy who's going to restore sanity and stability. So yeah, reading George Packer in The Atlantic, crying the authoritarian spirit. It just seems so far removed from reality. Just like on the face of it, the United States subsidizing Israel billions of dollars, right? It seems completely removed from reality. It's understandable why many Americans would rebel against that. And we just so happen to have a political system whereby lobbies can have a profound effect on public policy. Because when you have a tiny group who passionately cares about something, right, they will often override an overwhelming majority who disagree with them, but who aren't intense and passionate. Just think about the ability of Muslims to discourage those making pictorial depictions of Muhammad, because you've got a tiny, intense group of Muslims dedicated to opposing pictorial depictions of Muhammad. That has a vast discouraging effect, even if the overwhelming majority of citizens disagree with them because they're committed. And so, history of Judaism, you can see as the ever-renewing assertion of the most dedicated members of the Jewish people rising up and taking power against the acquiescence of a passive majority. So whether it's the devotees of Moses and the Torah, the devotees of the Maccabees and the Hanukkah story, the followers of the early Talmudic rabbis 2,000 years ago, or today, Orthodox Jews are only about 10-15% of the American Jewish population, but they are the dominant part of the American population. Or you can look at the disproportionate effect of African Americans in large parts of American life. Now, you can't talk about public policy, whether education, public transport, land use, law enforcement, judicial systems, without asking how's this going to affect African Americans, because African Americans have disproportionate influence in large areas of American life, just like Jewish Americans have disproportionate influence. So if you can join in with a group and apply pressure and you're intense, but you can change the world if you do things effectively. And so far, it seems to me the pro-Palestine and pro-Israel crowd is not acting effectively. And they forget that much of life is run by tiny groups of people. If you want to be effective, you have to speak their code. Right? Knowledge is a conversation through time by the people who decide what is knowledge. Foreign policy decided by a tiny group of people, not by popular sentiment. So I was reading in the New Yorker that these demonstrators distrust America because of the gap between reality and rhetoric. Right? So we have this rhetoric about democracy, yet America, like every other country, runs on hierarchy. Oh, read an article on Walter Cohn in the Atlantic. So Walter Cohn comes across as a pro-Trump conspiracy thinker. He was revolted by COVID restrictions, and I think he was wrong on that. So I believe in the conventional wisdom that social distancing, masks in confined spaces, and getting vaccinated were the right policies to pursue. With regard to COVID, for Walter Cohn, he experienced it as a personal affront and a denial of American liberties. So social distancing policies made it difficult for him to transport his dying father. And so Walter Cohn took this personally. And Walter Cohn, I think, grew up in Minnesota and got an elite education, had elite success as a writer and a novelist. He wrote that George Clooney movie that came out circa 2009 about this George Clooney character who would travel around firing people as a hired gun to fire people. And Walter Cohn discovered success in 2015, turning against the elite, of which he's a member. And he remembered being assigned an article by GQ to go hang out with war reenactors. And he produced a story that was incredibly sympathetic to these war reenactors, how they were coming out of a place of trauma, and how this had healing and meaning and purpose for them. And GQ just wanted an article denigrating those who engage in war reenactment. And so GQ would not publish his article. Right? And so it's not absurd to think that there are elite perspectives, that there's a dominant liberal left elite that controls most of our institutions, that dominates the high ground of culture, that dominates institutions like GQ, New Yorker, Atlantic, which tends to look down on NASCAR, middle Americans, people who hunt and engage in war reenactments. And so Walter Cohn revolted against this elite contempt for middle America. And he developed a reflexive hatred of the elites. And there is a rich shaft of following and power and often income to be developed from just continually mining down one particular shaft. but reflexive anti-elite sentiments are no more likely to be accurate than reflexive pro-elite sentiments, right? Sometimes the elite are wrong, sometimes they're right. And so Walter Kern sounds nutty and conspiratorial at times, and other times he has powerful, realistic, revealing things to say. So most people are a mixed bag, including Walter Kern, that's Kirn. His personal emotional reaction to COVID restrictions, I believe, is wrong. And his willingness to believe that there is an elite bent on destroying free speech in America is somewhat exaggerated. So he was serving on a panel with Renee DiResta, who's at Stanford University and researches misinformation. And she had an internship with the CIA. And Stanford has done projects in the American government, but she's not part of some ruling elite government foreign policy elite apparatus to restrict American speech. So I am not someone who's particularly concerned about misinformation, remember, because I believe we did not evolve to be gullible. So I don't believe that misinformation is a major problem. But there are some useful insights to be gleaned from people like Renee DiResta at Stanford and the Misinformation Project. Right? Just as there are useful insights to be gleaned from Walter Cohen, you just have to be discriminating. So it probably reduces anxiety and provides comfort to believe in some vast overarching theory, which is completely out of touch with reality, but gives you a ready identification of good guys and bad guys. So this would be either reflexively pro-Trump or reflexively anti-Trump. Right? You have a hero system with good guys and bad guys, and you have clarity, and I see how that's comforting. But if you want to be a more sophisticated thinker, right, you have to take each issue on its own merits. And appreciate the insights of the New Yorker, the New York Times. Sometimes Richard Spencer is right. Sometimes the Daily Caller is right. Sometimes Fox News is right. Sometimes CNN is right. Some stories CNN does a better job of covering than Fox News. Sometimes the LA Times does a better job covering a topic than local talk radio. Sometimes talk radio does a better job. So most people primarily learn about the world through consuming the news. And that's a deeply flawed way, but an understandable way of learning about the world. So most things we're probably better off giving primary importance to our own experiences, such as we may notice that different people have different gifts, and even though mainstream media treats this belief as horribly racist and bigoted and medieval, that our own life experience may back it up. And our own life experience may back up that there are significant differences between men and women, and that if men and women are ostensibly doing the same jobs, there's a statistic that women get paid 1/3 less, that that statistic is dubious because women may be more likely to choose jobs where they can work around their families, around taking care of their children and their loved ones. So recognizing different people have different gifts, different priorities, and experience life differently will give you a more sophisticated understanding of life than the bromides promoted by much of the academic elite and by the news media. Now, on the other hand, talk radio is usually part of the outrage industry, and it gins up an audience by getting people outraged. And sometimes they're right, sometimes they're wrong. But it's really easy to get hooked into outrage porn. Now, be careful who you follow on Twitter. That is, one of my friends are just in a perpetual state of outrage because of who they follow on Twitter. I see this in the dueling Arab-Israeli protests on campus. So I'm dominantly surrounded by pro-Israel people who follow pro-Israel accounts that highlight the horrible things done by the pro-Palestine crowd. But there are approximately as many horrible things done by the pro-Israel crowd. And if you're just getting a steady diet of outrage porn, all right, it's not going to be good for you. It's not going to give you clarity or ease. The Palestinians, the Arabs, right? That's their land too, right? The current Jewish state of Israel is erected on land where Arabs have lived for hundreds of years. And you can argue morally who has more of a right to the land, but it's not a particularly productive conversation. I think it's just easier to understand that Arabs and Palestinians have some valid claims. One can support the Jewish state and still have sympathy for their own sense of dispossession. On the other hand, there are a lot of ethnic groups that don't have their own nation state, like the Kurds. So you guys checked out Walter Kahn? So I think a good tip-off for where a pundit has ceased to be useful is if they're angry. Right? Anger tends to blind one. And so Walter Kahn often writes and speaks from a place of anger. And when he does that, I don't find him useful. So at one point when I first came to LA, I was living out of my car. I tried sleeping overnight in the parking lot of the Veterans Administration down the street there. And then some security guy came and knocked on my window and said, "You can't sleep here." And instead, I'd sleep on other streets around Westwood. I had a friend who was on the faculty at UCLA, Jules Zentner. And I'd go to his apartment in Westwood every morning to take a shower. Now, why the heck was I living out of my car for 7 months of my first year in LA? Well, it reflects a somewhat adventurous, irresponsible, chaotic style of life that didn't end there. Right? I could have gotten a job and an apartment, but instead I just wanted to go to acting auditions and modeling auditions and not hold down a job. And I just wanted the challenge of living out of my car for a few months to just save my money to do what I wanted. It reflected a lack of normal levels of self-care, of readiness to take adult responsibility, a yearning for excitement. I think so much of our political commentary, our political leanings are driven by our yearning for excitement. When you have a very clear idea of good guys and bad guys, that's more exciting because you get to take part in some universal struggle between the forces of good and the forces of evil. And if you can keep going back to the well, if you can keep going back to the mine shaft where you found rhetorical gold, right, that's comforting and strengthening, believing you can just keep going back there. And this is what I find with most pundits, right? You're much more compelling when you're excited, when you're passionate. But being passionate and excited and angry, where it produces more compelling content, it produces less clarity. Right? You get clarity from a dispassionate, disinterested, striving for objective and empathic point of view. Right? The more empathy you have, the less likely you are to be angry. The more empathy you have, right, the less likely you are to be consumed by the pursuit of excitement. But Walter Kern finds it tremendously exciting to be at war with America's elites. I think Tucker Carlson finds it tremendously exciting to be at war with America's elites, to be at war with the anti-Trump forces. And it's something that people have often noticed about me. That whereas these observers would say, "Look, I'm primarily concerned with my family, and we're just doing my job and taking care of my family." Right? You're always looking for excitement. You want life to be more exciting than it really is, and unfortunately, that's typical for people who don't have children. I think married people with kids, I noticed after Donald Trump's election, they might still detest or love Donald Trump, but they were less changed, a little less intense about it. They were less hyperbolic. So I know this highly accomplished woman who just took to bed for 6 weeks after Donald Trump's election, 2016, and essentially checked out of her adult responsibilities. Well, if you have young children, you can't do that. If you have a community, a spouse, family, extended family, friends who are counting on you, you can't just check out and go to bed for 6 weeks because you're depressed about a political result. I knew people who were afraid that they were going to be deported. They were just in tears after Donald Trump's victory, or they were tremendously elated after Donald Trump's victory. But the most intense people, most hyperbolic people, right, the most over-the-top reactions to Donald Trump came from people who did not have young children. Right? People who had young children, who had responsibilities, and people who depended on them could not afford to be distracted by the pulls of excitement of taking a strong definitive perspective on Donald Trump. And pundits, right, they need passion to be compelling. Right? They are in the entertainment business, they're in the whore business, right? They're providing for the needs of a particular customer. And the more passionately they can do this, right, the more effective they're going to be and the more status and money they're going to achieve. But this is going to come at the cost of clarity and truth and doing the right thing and being good for society. Right? What's good for pundits and live streamers, podcasters, and political activists, that intensity of emotion and commitment is usually bad for America. It's bad for public discussion. It's bad for social cohesion, social trust. It's bad for the individuals who consume their content. So in Judaism, there's this law or practice that you shouldn't study Kabbalah, Jewish mysticism, unless you're over the age of 40, married and with children. And you can't be a high priest, a Kohen, Gadol, unless you're over the age of 40, married with kids. In fact, you shouldn't serve on a Beit Din at a Jewish law court unless you're married with kids, because you lack the life wisdom that comes with having all these obligations to other people. And I notice with many people who don't have those obligations, how much more off track they tend to get, how much more easily distracted, how much more intense is their need for excitement and passion and a cause. This might be a very good treadmill video, good medley. I keep accidentally scrolling and it shows me vids of baby primates wearing human clothes. How am I supposed to stay with 40 when you won't even do a silly dance? It's hard to hear me. I am using my Shure mic. I'm doing everything I can to give you an excellent audio experience. Right? I'm giving you essential experience. You should hear the buzz of my voice, the resonance of my dulcet tones in your voice. This is an intimate, emotional, sensual experience with a high quality Shure mic. It's like jazz, listening for feelings, those ghost notes of vulnerability. You're going to stop for some food, make this Luke's fast foodie show. Well, I don't like intruding on others. So that's why I'm not using a gimbal. because when people walk around with a gimbal, it's just so much more obtrusive, and I notice it disturbs people. If I just walk around talking on my phone, it doesn't seem to disturb people. Walking around with my phone on a gimbal, it disturbs people. And so I feel an obligation to other people. I feel an obligation to society. I want to promote a more orderly, comfortable feeling of safety on people I pass on the street. And I don't want to achieve my live stream success at the expense of their well-being. If I put this phone on a gimbal, right, the superior tracking, the video quality will come at the expense of the well-being of the people I pass on the street. If I go into a store to order food, right, it would more likely disturb people and intrude on people. I don't want to do that. Right? I don't feel like I'm intruding on people because I'm not getting that message walking down the street, just talking on my phone. I'm not getting any indications that I'm intruding on people. But I don't like to talk on the phone when I'm riding in an Uber or riding in a bus or on a train or in a tightly enclosed public space because I don't want to reduce the comfort level of other people. It's very disturbing to hear just one-sided conversations when people you're stuck within an enclosed space to carry on conversations. So when I have to have conversations, I'm in a confined space. I let the other party know that I want to do a minimum of talking. Instead, they need to do most of the talking. I'm just going to listen. So I don't want to bother others. I had a friend who's got a very loud motorcycle. It's much more convenient for him to start his motorcycle in his cul-de-sac, but it was very loud and that would disturb all the other people in his cul-de-sac. I encouraged him, just push your motorcycle 100 yards out of the cul-de-sac into the street and then start your motorcycle. When I leave my house in the early morning or late at night, I don't like to be talking on my cell phone, so I tell people, look, I'm going to stay quiet for a minute. So I don't want to disturb the people who are close to me. We live in a society and we should be monitoring the effect that we have on other people. Audio is poor, but you're in LA. Flaunt your gimbal. I hear the trees singing now. Audio just got better. Okay, so thanks for the feedback. The audio is better when I have the mic closer to my mouth. So right now the mic is an inch from my mouth, as opposed to now when the mic is like 8 inches from my mouth. So a good reminder that here it's 8 inches and here it's 1 inch. Much better audio quality, I would assume, when I keep the mic an inch from my mouth. So that's inconsiderate of you. I'm going around mumbling because I got the mic a foot or 8 inches away from my mouth.